Grace and peace to you in the name of Jesus Christ. Whenever you're preparing to depart a position such as I've held with you all since 2017, there's lots of difficult goodbyes, emotional days, meaningful moments. But I'll say this, there's also a lot of terribly mundane administrative stuff that you have to do. This last week, stuck at home, I took on the task of starting to transfer many of the accounts that my email address has to remain here with the church and not go with me to Portland. For any of you that have ever gone through the process of changing an account's email address and name, you know it's not as easy as you think it should be. They run you through the gamut of security checks, they send codes to your phone, and they make you put in all types of different information. One such account this week, I won't tell you which one, because I don't want you hacking in. But one account this week that I was transferring over required me to put in 3 new security questions. Not for me, mind you. I'm not going to be getting back into the account, but I have to figure out what those 3 answers are going to be that somebody else can figure out. And so, as I'm going through the list of the possible questions for this particular account, one of the questions stuck out to me that said, I really hope our congregation can get this one. Because the question that came up on the account was, what is one word that describes your organization's mission? Thankfully, Paul is not alive to hack into our account. But you may have guessed, based on our epistle reading from Paul today, the word that I chose to describe what our mission is as the church is love. It's the first word of our mission statement as a church too. But Paul today in his epistle reading gets at the heart of the matter for the church at Corinth, for this community of folks that's in the midst of divisive conflict amongst one another. Because the church at Corinth, this community of early believers, they are arguing about which spiritual gifts are best. Some say it's prophecy, some say it's speaking in tongues, and these groups of people are raised up against one another. And Paul is in the midst of writing this letter to the church to try and quell the divisiveness and the tension in the midst of the community. In chapter 12 and chapter 14, the pieces of bread on this sandwich, he's talking about the variety of spiritual gifts that are necessary in a church community, and that not one of them is more important than any other. But in the midst of this sandwich, Paul gets at the heart of the matter for the church, and he begins to say, you know what? It is not about the spiritual gifts themselves. It's not about which party or group of people in the church is right. It's not about which group of people has better gifts than one another. The heart of the matter for the church is these things eventually will go away. But the one thing that will remain and that continues to be the heart of the church then and now is what? Love. Paul puts love in the center of the community and says, in the midst of your conflict, let us come back to this gift that God gives us that never ends. And Paul isn't talking about a sentimental feeling or an adjective about how we would describe love. In the Greek texts of his letter, he uses verbs, actions to describe what love is. Our scriptures and our interpretations don't always do a good job of getting the right tenses for these things. But imagine in Paul's words, what he's telling the church at Corinth is this: love practices patience. Patience is not just a descriptor, it is something that we actively practice and do. Paul then would go on to say, love acts kindly. In the midst of conflict, love acts kindly to one another. He goes on to list a number of things that love is not, naming likely some of the actions and behaviors he's seen on display in this church community, saying it is not envious of one another. It is not boastful. It is not arrogant. It is not rude. We see plenty of that in our world today, do we not? But Paul goes on at the end to give 4 last actions to describe how we are to live out love in community. Love believes all things. Love trusts all things. My mind is giving me a moment here. Hopes all things. How do you forget hope? Love endures all things. Actions, ways of life Paul wants the church community to engage with, to actively show love to one another through how we relate and act in the world. Paul's sentiment is good. But for all of us together as the church today, I think we can acknowledge that actually living out love today is a lot more complicated than just reading words on the page. In the midst of a pandemic for 2 years, we have been challenged because our way of loving one another has been flipped upside down. I've grappled with this week. Does love mean showing up here to preach and to spread virus potentially amongst the congregation? Does love mean giving hugs and handshakes? Or does love mean keeping distance and staying apart? It doesn't make any sense to us. But that's not the only discernment that our life of love takes. In my time as your pastor, I've walked alongside so many of you that have grappled with those questions of what does it mean to love in the midst of this difficult moment in our lives? What does it mean to love my child or my children or my family when they're doing things that doesn't seem right, that I just wish I could fix or make different? Or perhaps for so many of you that have been caregivers for your own families, people that you've had to love. What does it mean to care for an aging parent as they need to move out of their home? What does it mean when it comes to taking away car keys when somebody shouldn't drive? How do you make decisions about end-of-life care that somehow seem contradictory to how you wish you could love somebody else, but you know you have to make a different decision? It's even harder for many of us in our families across the divisions and conflicts that exist, not just in the church, but in our world today. What does it mean to love your family members that maybe identify differently than you politically? Or maybe are really upset about something that you posted on Facebook? How do you love in the midst of times where it feels like the only thing we can do is identify the differences in someone else rather than trying to find commonalities amongst one another? And then what does it mean to love somebody different than ourselves? What does it mean to be in their footsteps, to have compassion for them, to learn about their stories, and to think about what it actually takes to love somebody the way they need to be loved? Love is hard. Love oftentimes is not clear-cut and simple or straightforward. Love takes discernment. And sometimes, as we learned from Jesus today, love means taking a risk. Jesus very clearly in his hometown, in his synagogue, says some words that get his family and his hometown a little bit riled up. Because what Jesus is saying in these stories as he invokes the widow from Zarephath and Naaman from Syria is that God's healing grace and love does not just come to those on the inside, but in fact, Jesus has been sent to the outsider, the person who has not traditionally received God's love and blessing, the person that maybe you would call enemy. Jesus himself takes risks in order to love. The risks of being crucified and killed, not on that cliff that day, but ultimately by the religious authorities and the Roman government that puts him on a cross. But somehow, some way, he makes his way on through. Not even death itself can end the love of God made manifest in Jesus. Today, on my last Sunday with you all, in the midst of these scriptural stories that we have heard, there's two things I want to say and do. The first is to acknowledge the ways that I have fallen short in loving you the way that you needed to be loved. The ways that I, rather than seeing you face to face, saw only in a mirror dimly. Recognizing only myself, my own plans or hopes or control, and did not see or spend time or love you the way you needed to be loved. I ask your forgiveness. I believe, as any pastor should, as they begin to depart, to acknowledge the ways that they have fallen short. Because as good as these years have been, as challenging as they have been, we acknowledge that sometimes we just don't do what needs to be done. But I don't want to leave it there, because that's not really what grace and hope and the gospel are about. It certainly is about humility, bearing confession and receiving forgiveness and grace. But it's about celebrating the ways that God's love has shown up, even in the midst of times where you didn't think it was going to be possible. Even in those places of death and loss of life, how it is that love persists, makes its way through, and does something new. Because ultimately, that is the story of our community these last 5 years. Not just our failings and shortcomings, but ultimately the celebrations and goodness that God has done here at Patton and Iliff Court. Because when I first walked in these doors on July 31st, goodness, my dates are escaping me. July 31st, 2016, this community didn't know if they were going to continue to exist. We thought we were going to close the doors of this place, some of us. And yet here we are. We have made it. And I'll tell you this, it's not because of our building. It's not because of our worship. It's not because of our programs. And despite what some of you have told me these last couple of weeks, it's not because of me. We are here today because our congregation, front and center, took these words from Paul and we put love at the center. We put this gift of God's grace and compassion and relationship and generosity, and we made that what mattered most. And we showed up here week in and week out as a community. We embraced one another in the good times and in the difficult ones. We gathered online when we needed to, and we came back in person when we could. And through it all, in the midst of things we may have disagreed about, we still committed to loving one another and loving the community around us. Those are the stories that will persist from this day going forward. It is those stories of love that were shown out into this community and world that will be the hallmark of these last 5 years. The food that has been distributed, the care team meetings where we discerned and talked together of how to care for people who were sick and dying. The visits, not just from me, but from a caring group of a congregation that showed up to love one another, not just in person, but through cards and phone calls and emails and other ways over these years. It's going to be the stories of people that, despite old age and tired bones, still showed up to care for the trees and the plants and the property. It's the courageous leadership of people from day one that said, we're not giving up on this mission of the church yet. We're going to keep going, despite what seems exhausting to do. This was all possible because of love. The love received through God and the love that you all chose to embody these years. And there is nothing after I leave this place and your community that can stop love. There is nothing that can get in the way of love continuing. Death cannot stop love. A pandemic cannot stop love. Neighbors filled with hatred and prejudice cannot stop love. The divisions of our world, the politics of today, the divisiveness between us cannot stop love. The departure of your pastor cannot stop love. Because as Paul says, love never ends. May the unconditional grace and love of God guide you, be with you, give you courage on this path to come. Amen.